Good evening and most welcome to H 1434 or 1434 if you prefer. And we are with the book Rethinking the Inner, Wittgenstein by Johnston. We have now entered into page 20, the last paragraph after the insertion Wittgensteinian quote. We are discussing the private linguist. To reinforce this argument, let us consider the private linguist case in more detail. Suppose she claims to have set up rules which give her a subjective justification for using the word as she does. She might, for example, claim that she has some sort of table or dictionary in her imagination, and that when she believes she is experiencing as, she compares the sensation with her memory of sensation S. And applies the word when the two are the same. But how can she determine whether or not she is remembering S correctly? In other words, how can she distinguish between the comparison showing the two are in fact the same, and her simply believing that this is what the comparison shows? When the private linguist says, "I believe it is S again," one might reply, perhaps you only believe you believe it. Since neither she nor we can check the supposed justificatory process, it makes no sense to treat it as justificatory process at all. We cannot check, and more importantly, neither can she. Instead of a process of independent verification, all we have is a procedure whereby if the private linguist says it is justified, it is, and if not, not. At the end of the comparison, the private linguist is exactly where she started, for all she is left with is her inclination to say that she was again experiencing S. Since the supposed justification is on exactly the same level as the initial impression, it is a sham. It is as if someone were to buy several copies of the morning newspaper to assure himself that what it said was true. What is misleading here is the idea of a subjective justification. The notion that the individual can establish the correctness of her judgment by, for example, consulting a table in her imagination. As Wittgenstein points out, however, a check in the imagination is not a real check. Because it does not actually involve appealing to something independent. It might be compared to testing the structure of a bridge by imagining it being subjected to increasingly heavy weights. This might be called testing the bridge in one's imagination, but it would not justify a particular choice of dimensions. For the imaginative exercise does absolutely nothing to show the bridge will actually hold up. Like the private linguist's ostensive definition, the imaginative exercise is modeled on a real activity and uses its vocabulary. The difference, however, is that it does not have the same consequences. It is like one hand trying to give the other money. My right hand can write a deed of gift, and my left hand a receipt. But the further practical consequences would not be those of a gift. When the left hand has taken the money from the right, we shall ask, well, and what of it? And the same could be asked if a person had given himself a private definition of a word. I mean, if he has said the word to himself and at the same time has directed his attention to a sensation. The private linguist apes the process of ostensive definition, but does so in the absence of the context which gives that process its sense. She claims to be laying down rules and setting up a practice, but no rules are actually specified. And if she tries to check her rule following, the only answer she can ever get is, if you think you're right, and if not, not. All this would seem to show that the sign S is useless. From the start, it was clear that it cannot be used to communicate. For ex hypothesi, others cannot understand it. Furthermore, we have seen that it cannot even be of use to the private linguist herself, for she cannot distinguish between being inclined to apply to it and being justified in applying it. Suppose, however, that we did discover a use for it. We might, for example, discover a correlation between the individual saying, "I'm experiencing S again," and rise in her blood pressure. This would be useful insofar as it would enable us to tell that the individual's blood pressure was rising without using any apparatus. The key point, however, is that it would make no difference whether or not the individual was correct in thinking she recognized the situation. Recognize the sensation. What we would actually have correlated with a high rise in blood pressure is the individual saying, or being inclined to say, "I'm experiencing S again." In a sense, therefore, it does not matter whether the sensation is the same or not. or more accurately, since the only criterion for the occurrence of the sensation is what the individual says, the only possible grounds for calling it the same are the individual herself saying so. Thus, where the sign S does have a use, this is not because it refers to a private event. Indeed, the letter plays absolutely no role in the language claim. It is a mere ornament, not connected with the mechanism at all. The relationship between the sign and the sensation is quite different from what the private linguists imagined, rather than marking the occurrence of an inner event. Use of the sign is in fact the only basis for our talk of a particular inner event having occurred. So it doesn't have to be an so-called inner experience, it can be an outer experience. The same holds. There is no way of the person or anyone else judging whether the experience is correct or not. And this is very, very pertinent. It shows that we are mistaken when it comes to understanding what is inner talk. What could it be? The above line of thought is summarized in Wittgenstein's famous beetle in the box argument. There, Wittgenstein notes that since the inner object is in principle inaccessible to others, there's no way of knowing that two people are experiencing the same thing. Consequently, if we accepted the private linguist's account, we would have to admit that pain might refer to something different in each person. However, if others can never know the object to which the names supposedly refer, then the use of the word cannot involve reference to that object. In that case, however, the whole idea of the private object drops out of consideration. Yeah, and that is absolutely clear. We would not be able to speak of anything inner at all. And the point is, outer also false. How could we know that that person is referring correctly to being sick from within that person? There is absolutely no way of checking, and therefore private language is impossible. It has to be a communal language game that is shared, even for such things as pain. It cannot be subjective. There's no chance whatsoever. That's a very strong argument. And here from Philosophical Investigation, quote, "Suppose everybody had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one could look into anyone else's box. And everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite impossible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. Yeah. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might be empty. No one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. And this, my friends, is very close to identity when it comes to atoms. And Leibniz's argument, there is no way of looking inside of the monad. They don't have windows. And neither do we have windows. For to what would those windows lead? It's a bit of nonsensical, paradoxical non-thought things to say that an inner decides what we're thinking. Actually, it cancels out, and that goes for the inner as well. No longer can inner and outer exist. They disappear from view. And this is what happened in modern times. Thus, the idea that the word designates a private inner object is empty. If our sensation words have use, they must function in some other way than the private linguist imagines. As the above arguments illustrate, Wittgenstein's attack on the private linguist has various elements. To illuminate the interrelation, he compares the notion of a private ostensive definition with the design for a motor he was once shown. According to this design, the motor would be located inside a hollow roller with both its crankshaft and its cylinder attached to the wall of the roller. At first glance, the construction seems possible. But as Wittgenstein points out, it is a rigid system and the piston cannot move to and fro in the cylinder. Unwittingly, we have deprived it of all movement. There are, however, two ways of seeing the fault in the construction. The direct way is to note that the cylinder could be rolled from outside regardless of whether or not the motor was running. The indirect way is to notice that the device is a rigid construction and not a motor at all. Similarly, there are two ways of recognizing the error in the idea of private ostensive definition. The direct method is to note. As in the beetle in the box argument, that private objects are irrelevant to our use of sensation words. As far as our actual use is concerned, the private inner object could be present, absent, or constantly changing. It would make no difference. The only thing that can play a role in our language game is what is accessible to us, and that is the individual's utterances. The indirect way of seeing what is wrong with the idea of private ostensive definition is to realize that it is not, in fact, a definition at all. The connection between the word and its purported referent is rigid. For the criterion for S having occurred is that the private linguist believes it has occurred. The private inner object is an illusion. S does not refer to an independent entity. Rather, it is the use of S that provides the criterion for saying that a specific experience has occurred. So, the point with the motor example is you need to check it out. You can think about it as much as you can. You can try to use your private language, but in the end you need to put it together and understand it. Someone else who saw it this way, uncannily close to the Wittgensteinian notion, is Barbara Tversky, who showed that in order to understand an engine, actually, we need to do the movement that the engine does. So you see here, no matter what word it is, we need its, so to say, use, construction, place, etymology, history. They are not just out there. And the engine example, I would say, is even possible to make a drawing of, to make it even clearer. You can imagine me saying that this rather complex thing that can cause fire. I can describe it, but I cannot use my inner private language to sort of check whether it's working or not. Imagine I am an inventor. I need to try it. And no other ways. And so it goes for complex words that we deemed abstract. Well, they are still abstract, but they are not empty. All the words we are using are full of meaning. This emptiness that sort of we have a feeling for, I had a feeling for, is coming from the fact of this misunderstanding. What you should say, some words will be full for you and usable, and some words you need to in the future learn, you could learn them, some you will never understand to the fullest, and it would be in most cases a degree of skill of using the word. This is an incredibly marvelous way of dissolving the mind-matter problem, because no longer are the thinking processes airy, ethereal, unreal, undecisive, hard to catch. Instead, they are firmly put into the language game, into reality. In a way, it's an incredibly positive message that Wittgenstein is presenting. I'll try to do some depiction of this. You put a pause there for a sec. So we're looking at the private ostensive. The motor was what did it for me to the understanding, and it was pretty close to Barbara Tversky too. I think that helped. This is an excellent, how can you say, pedagogical tool of Wittgenstein. Made me understand. So we have a sort of description. There's no need for you to see all the details. According to this design, the motor will be located inside a hollow roller, a cylinder, and the piston goes up and down. The piston is this thing that covers the inside of the cylinder, make it airtight. And the point is here that it needs to be checked. And in the usual sense, we have two things. We have an inner mental process going on, depicting the piston and the machine, the motor. And then we have the actual motor. We have two things. That's dualism. In this case, the description and what happens in the cylinder is the same thing. And what we take away is private language. It simply doesn't work. And in the motor example, there is no way on earth that anyone could understand whether it's working or not, just by what we think normally to be solely inner. And as Wittgenstein showed, that inner is not what we think it is, some sort of secluded, isolated inner, that is pure inner. This inner is quite different. This inner is the inner that understands. And that's a knowledgeable, penetrating inner. It's having action. Why action? Well, there is an incredible level of degrees of understanding whatever it is. Actually, the motor is a pretty simple example. A word could be as complex as civilization, or why not the Roman tradition of toga bearing, or winemaking, or the ability to enjoy a particular musical concert. That could be the most complicated. In the ostensive private language illusion, those things gets nullified into nothing. And then we have empty concepts. Wittgenstein is healing that, showing, yes, there is a corollary. Yes, our concepts do not need to be empty. They are empty now, but they do not have to remain empty. They could be more and more filled. And once they get filled, we will go from, to use a Heideggerian term, from denken to danken. And this is actually Wittgenstein giving an excellent example of zu handeln, using it with what he called language game. But as we know, it has very little to do with spoken or written language. It covers all activities, including objects and static things. Private language is not an ideology. Neither is it a concept. The two words private language is an invention by Wittgenstein. By naming it, he has already started out well. He points, I'm using the ostensive word here, he points to the risk of falling to an unnamed trap. It's a trap because it's unnamed, unvisualized, unfantasized. Another example I came up with here is a chessboard. I've written a chessboard here. And you can think of, I move pawn from a7 to g4, for instance. Odd move for a pawn. Should have been horse. Is that possible? Well, if I am trained enough with the outside of the chessboard, I will be able to, in my inner thinking, be correct. But it's always a degree. It's a matter of degree. The left hemisphere thinking of the private ostensive naming does not accept degrees. It's either true or untrue. Wittgenstein shows it's always a level, always more or less. And there is no end to an understanding of a thing like a piston or machinery or chessboard even. It never gets finished. Another viewpoint in this is how we move our bodies. I think that the private language has affected our way of thinking our movement. we no longer go into movement, we're not specific. And when we move in a bad way, that is private language. We try to check a movement against an imagined inner subject of some sort. And it goes completely haywire. We become misusers of our body and mind. Wittgenstein shows a disease in the thinking process. You don't have to give up any belief in anything or any ideology or any literary theory or your dislike for going out on a foggy day or whatever it might be. This is a misunderstanding of sorts. It's not a misunderstanding in the proper sense. But realizing it more and more and practicing it will help anything you do. And I was just realizing so Handen really comes through for me here now. I begin to understand what it's really about. It is understanding what gives what we do meaning. Even if it's a word or if it's a movement with our hand. It could be a gesture to show something. It could be something that is supposed to be aesthetical. It could be either, it could be anything on the scale. I think Barbara Conable with her body map is also pointing to this. That we have a private language of how we are constructed, not checked against a practice of communal things. Think the body is private somehow, or the meaning we put to the parts is somehow private. That specific detail is not private. Your body is your body, but the use of the body parts are not private, because there would be no corollary. It wouldn't make any sense. I can imagine some people at one instant feels a certain loss of a transcendental, unreal world where the meanings are living somewhere, some Platonic cave. But Wittgenstein goes one step further. That heaven is in itself a paradox, something that is impossible. And isn't that fantastic news? If you've been dreaming for those things, they do not really make sense even to yourself. So he's not even taking anything away from you. He just adds whatever you are doing. Could be a plumber and still have fantastic use for this, but especially within the field of education. This is an incredible helper. Once more language can come to the fore, it can become something that is usable, and people will listen once more to the ones who put their effort in understanding higher matters, abstract things. And that, of course, was one of the goals of Wittgenstein, to put the more higher thinking into working mode once more, to make higher education something that was possible. Jolly, a very short comment maybe from Kalle here. Sorry, I took some time, I was enthused.
Good evening. So, Johnston quotes Wittgenstein philosophical investigations, and Wittgenstein uses this example. Let us pretend that this is money, and my right hand gives the money to my left hand. It's possible, and to do that, and I get a sensation, weight. I get some weight goes to the left hand instead, and this is now empty. But it's not a notion of gift, because it's only a transferal of one some money from right hand to left hand to myself. Wittgenstein's point is that you need an outsider, that is, say, Hans, who can, so to say, Hans' eyes, he can, so to say, control if there has been a transaction that is between two different individuals. That is, otherwise it is not a gift, it's only I'm playing game with myself. That could be fun, of course, doing patience. What do you call it in English? Patience? Yes. But you can play patience.
Yeah.
Something, a game for myself, but it doesn't have any points. So
a solitary game.
Solitary game, thank you. And it's also a good, excellent variation of MCS's famous lithograph drawing hands, where you have two hands which are both drawing. And there, I think, at least from, as I understand the illustration, is that you need an outsider, or myself, ideally speaking, it's an outsider who shakes the two hands. So you cannot have private hands doing their own stuff. You need somebody outsider who, so to say, corrects or decides the reality. Now I will not continue, we have a little time. I thank Hans, if you want to add something.
No, it was excellent with the gift. You can do that and it will become boring, and it won't be effective. And let me once more underline what I said in the previous, the penultimate lecture. He's not criticizing the idea of an interiority. We still have an interior part of ourselves. So don't, it is a specific point he's making here, and that is of private checking of what you're thinking. I would say my commentary is it would make the inner even stronger and the outer. And the inner side is something that is badly neglected in modern Western culture. We have become, I would say, thanks to this soulless, lacking consciousness, lacking all those qualities of the inner, they can now come to the fore. And Wittgenstein was himself an excellent example of that. He was a deeply spiritual man, one of the few of all the philosophers, maybe possibly Heidegger. Thank you very much for your patience, and have a very good night. Bye bye.
Bye.